Good morning, Year 5. So today I've created a video about today's warm-up and math task, and we're mostly looking at decimals on a number line. So the warm-up today is I'm thinking of some decimal numbers between 1 and 2. What might they be? And give at least 15 answers. So you might look at that and feel a bit overwhelmed, but I'm going to explain to you how we can answer that question. One of the best ways to picture decimal numbers in this way is on a number line. And so we're going to do it on a number line, and that will really help you with today's task as well. So here I have a number line between 1 and 2. So that is one whole number between 1 and 2. And on here, you can see that there's black lines with decimals written. What are those increments? What do they represent? Okay, they are tenths. Each of these is 1/10 or 1/10 or 0.1, okay? But you can see that inside each of those tenths, you can divide it further into 10 equal parts, okay? And this was explained on the very first video on Math Antics. So if you didn't watch that, you should. It was a really great explanation explaining that with decimal numbers, as we move further away from the decimal point, then we are actually reducing by tenths. We are taking that previous number and we're dividing it into 10 equal pieces. Whereas that's the opposite with whole numbers, because as you move further away from the decimal point with whole numbers, they get bigger by 10. When you're working with decimals, as the number gets longer, they're getting smaller by 10. Okay, so these tenths that are divided into 10 equal parts are what? They are hundredths. Okay, so each of those is 1/100th, or 0.01. Okay, 1/100th. We know in our decimal place value chart that it goes tenths and then hundredths, and each of these is 1/100th. Okay, so if we can check that there are 100 of them. There should be 100 of them because it's hundredths. So if we know we have 10 here, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. There's 100 of them. They are hundredths, each of those little grey lines. Okay, and you can see here that 10 of the hundredths is actually 1/10. And we've talked about that previously, but sometimes that's hard to understand what I mean when I say that. But you can see here that if I had 10 of those hundredths, I'd actually have 1/10, 0.1. Okay, just like with trading with whole numbers, that once you get 9 and then you get 10, you know how you trade and you move along? It's the same with decimals. Okay, how do we record our tenths? That 0 shouldn't be there. 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, they're written on there. They are our tenths, but there are only 9 of them. So if you're asked to record 15 numbers, decimal numbers between 1 and 2, you can't just do tenths because there's only 9 of them. So we're going to have to go into hundredths. How do we record hundredths as a decimal? For example, you might have 1.01, okay, no tenth, but 1/100th, 1.02, or you might have some tenths and have 1.11, 1.12. Now, there are literally 100 of those that I could write, so I've only written 4 out of the 100. Okay, so your task for the warm-up today is to think of 15 of these numbers. So let's have a little check. This little red dot here, how would you record that as a decimal? Have a think. Okay, so there's one whole, we know that, one whole, and then we have one of these hundredths. It's not a tenth yet, just a hundredth. So how would we record one whole and 1/100th as a decimal? If you think it's 1.01, you are correct. One whole, no tenths, 1/100th, 1.01. So that could be one of your answers. What about this red dot? What decimal number does it represent? Have a think. Okay, so for this decimal number, we still have one whole, of course, but this time we have 5/10. You can see them. We have 5/10, and then we have 2 of the hundredths. So how do we represent a decimal number that has one whole, 5/10, and 2 hundredths? If you're thinking 1.52, then you are correct. We'll just do one more as a practice. Have a look at this decimal point. This point on the number line. And tell me how could you represent that as a decimal number? There's 1 whole. There are 8 tenths because we're just past 1.8. And it's also 9 hundredths. I know it's 9 because it's 1 before the end. So 1 whole, 8 tenths, 9 hundredths. How do we represent that as a decimal? As a decimal number? You're thinking 1.89. You are correct. So there we have some examples of decimals between 1 and 2. Okay, there are literally 100 there for you to choose from for this activity. So if you are doing the warm-up now, I suggest you pause the video with this number line on the screen and write down your 15 decimal numbers. If you want to really challenge yourself, you can actually take each of these hundredths and divide it into 10 equal pieces. And each of those would be thousandths. And then you're looking at decimal numbers to 3 decimal places, because we know that the third place behind the decimal point is thousandths. So you might have 1.111, for example. So the possibilities for this question are literally endless. There is an infinite number of decimal numbers between 1 and 2. But for you guys, you might focus on just the tenths and the hundredths, or if you're up for a real challenge, tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. So pause the video and have a go. Okay, so your actual task today is looking at a number line and telling me what the value is of different places on the number line, which is exactly what we were just doing. So the first question I want you to ask yourself, what is each increment on this number line? What those little gray lines, what does each of them mean? And you can see here that between 1 and 2, because we've actually got like 3 holes on here, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and 3 to 4. Okay, so you've actually got 3 holes there. You're missing 0 to 1, so don't get confused and think it's 4 holes. It's not. There's only 3 holes on there. But what's each increment? Well, it's divided into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 equal pieces. So that means that they are tenths. So each of these is 1/10 or 0.1. Very similar to what we were just doing. Okay, and the next question is, what is the value of A? So we can see here that A, there is 1 whole and 1/10. So how do we record a decimal number? That is 1 whole and 1/10. Have a think. Okay, if you're thinking 1.1, then you are correct. It is 1.1. My screen seems to have frozen. There we go. Okay, so for our next number line, it's a little bit different because this time you can see that we have a 1 and then we have a 3. And you might notice that there is something missing. Now my computer has frozen. So I'm just going to start this again. So you might notice that there is something missing. And 2, you might have noticed that 2 is not marked on there. So where would 2 go? Where do you think 2 would be marked on this number line? Have a think. So if you're thinking it will be halfway between 1 and 3, you'd be correct. And if you've counted, you'd notice there are 20 increments between 1 and 3, which means halfway is going to be 10 increments. So halfway is where that red line is, okay? And that will be 2 on your number line. So what if we now know that's 2, what is each increment worth on this number line between 1 and 2, for example, or between 2 and 3? What is each increment worth? So each whole number is divided into 10 equal parts. So between 1 and 2, there are 10 equal parts. So therefore, they are tenths. So each increment is 1/10 or 0.1, exactly the same as our last number line. So what is the value, for example, of K? All right, you're asked to find the value of all of them. But for example, K. K is going to be what? How many wholes and how many tenths? Have a think. How would you write it as a decimal? If you're thinking it is 2.2, you are correct because there are 2 wholes and 2 tenths. And so you just need to remember that. And remember the increments don't change. So if it's tenths here, it's going to be tenths here, it's going to be tenths here and beyond. So when you're looking, for example, at J, you're looking at 3 wholes and then count your tenths to see what the decimal number is. So that is your task for today. And good luck, Year 5. I have every confidence that you can do it if you just stop and think and check your increments and make sure you are correct by checking those and counting those. And don't forget, you can watch this video and pause it if you need help. All right, have a great day.
Are you finished?